Hi, it's Ian here. Welcome to another 5-minute marketing tip. As you can see, the Great Beard Experiment is still going. We're 26 days in and it is still growing. But more seriously, today's 5-minute marketing tip is for you if you want to be seen as an authority or an expert in your field. And it's a technique that will help boost your credibility and your believability as an expert by having a really clear origin story. I'll explain why and how to do it after the break. Hi, welcome back. So if you've ever read any superhero comics or watched any of the films recently, you'll know that they take great pains to always explain to you how that hero got their powers, their origin story. So for some reason we find it just that bit more believable that Spider-Man can climb walls and shoot webbing out of his fingers because he was bitten by a radioactive spider. We find it a bit more believable that Superman can fly and is amazingly strong because he comes from a planet with a red sun. We find it believable that Doctor Strange knows all this weird magic because he trained with the Ancient One in the mountains of Tibet. Having an origin story helps people believe why you have amazing powers. And if you think about it, as an expert in your field, you have amazing powers too. The reason people hire you is because you can do things that other people can't do. Now, usually that's to do with your knowledge and your experience, but it's still superpowers. And if you can have an origin story, so rather than your About Me page and your introduction being a kind of random collection of facts, if there can be a clear narrative there that explains how you got the powers that you have, then people are inclined to believe it a bit more and trust in your skills and your capabilities a bit more. So I'll explain how with a couple of examples. What I'm going to give you is a handful of different types of origin story that you can think about and think whether your experience fits into that particular model, or you can come up with your own models. But it's nice to have either one or a combination of a couple of models that makes it really clear why you have the abilities you have. The simplest one, and one of the ones that's used the most, is the I've been there and done it myself model. So if you are teaching something, as a consultant, a coach, a trainer, etc., and you've done that thing for yourself, then you're more believable. So for example, if you wanted to learn how to become an entrepreneur and you got the chance of being trained by Richard Branson, for example, that would be very believable and credible because Branson has been a very, very successful entrepreneur for a long period of time. So you would assume that he would be able to teach you how to do it. Now, most of us, unfortunately, haven't got 40 years of experience of doing something. So if you have, that's great and you can use that. If you haven't, you have to look at a different model. So another good model you can use is the researcher model. Now, this is something I hinted at a couple of videos ago when I talked about doing research projects. So if you look at someone like Jim Collins, for example, the author of Good to Great and Built to Last, he's a very high paid consultant to senior executives in corporate organizations, showing them how to make their business more effective, to grow, to be more profitable. But Collins has never run a major corporation himself. What he has done is he's studied a whole load of them to understand what makes some successful and some less successful, and that gives him the credibility to advise corporate executives. Similarly with Neil Rackham in the field of sales. Neil has never been, a salesperson for a very long period of time himself. He was a psychology researcher. But what he has done, he sat in, unfortunately for him, on more sales meetings than pretty much anyone else in the world, studied them, analysed them, seen what works and what doesn't work, and therefore you can trust his judgment and his training and his teaching on that topic. So that's the researcher model. Another model that works really well is the previous life model. That's where something you did in a previous life that isn't directly the same as what you're teaching now actually lends credibility to it. If you look at, some of you may know Joe Navarro, for example. Joe is a real well-known expert in the field of body language. And he trains businesses in body language. His previous life was one of the founding members of the Behavioral Analysis Unit in the FBI. And he did that for 20, 30 years or whatever. And his credibility today in teaching business people how to understand and analyse and look at body language isn't based on having done it in business. It's based on having done it in the FBI. And people's assumption is, well, if you did it in the FBI, he must be really good at it. So easily good enough to teach in business. Similar example of that would be in the area of media training. A lot of the people who do media training, where they teach business people how to be able to handle tricky questions from the media, how to be interviewed, how to appear on TV or radio, etc., are people who were journalists or TV presenters themselves before. Because who better to show you how to answer tricky questions from journalists and presenters than someone who was a journalist or a presenter who used to ask those tricky questions in the past. Similarly, I have a friend who's an ex-comedian who teaches people presentation skills today. And again, the logic people have is, well, if he could stand up in front of a room full of drunken people in a comedy club and get his message across to them, then surely he could teach me how to get my message across to other business people. So your previous life, even though it wasn't exactly the same as what you're doing today, gives you credibility because there's a common theme. Often what you used to do is a more extreme version of what you're teaching people to do today. Another good model is the power behind the throne model. That's where you haven't necessarily done something yourself, but you've taught others, you've helped others, you've done something behind the scenes where you've got other people to do what you're now teaching people to do. So a good example of that is Mitch Russo. Mitch is a fellow speaker of mine at the Authority Super Summit that's coming up soon, and Mitch appeared on my podcast a little way back. And one of the things Mitch has done in his career is he was head of operations for a business that Tony Robbins and Chet Holmes had, where he took that business from being very small, scaled it and grew it very fast to being a big, successful business. So it wasn't his business, he did it for someone else. Now, particularly in the area of a done-for-you service, that's good positioning, the ability to do it for someone else, because you look at Mitch and think, you know what, he managed to grow Tony Robbins' business really successfully. Maybe he can grow my business really successfully. In some ways, that's better positioning than doing it for yourself, because if someone does it for themselves, you might doubt whether they could do it for anyone else, maybe if it's tied up with their own personality and their own particular skills. But if you've done it for someone else, then people will logically think you could do it for them. Now, the final model is a model I really like. It's based on the been there and done it myself model, but it's for those of us who maybe don't have 40 years of experience in a particular area, but still have some skills we want to help people with. And it's the Trailblazer model. The Trailblazer model is where you are 2 or 3 steps ahead of people, and you're very open about that. You don't say, I've got 50 years of experience in this area, I'm a real world leading expert. You say, you know what, I'm currently experimenting, trying things out in this area, and I think you might be able to learn from me and my experiences, and I'm going to report my results and tell you what's happening. It's particularly good where the field you work in, the field you're an expert, is changing rapidly, is very new. So a good example of that today would be someone like John Loomer, the Facebook advertising expert. No one could say they've got 40 years in Facebook advertising because it wasn't around more than a few years ago. But what John does is whenever Facebook introduce new advertising features, he quickly takes those features, tests them out in his own business, see what works and sees what doesn't work, documents that, and then teaches it to people in his Power Hitters Club and documents it on his blog. So he's able to say to people, you know, I've been running a test on this new Facebook feature for the last 3 weeks. Here are the results I've got. Here's what seems to work. Here's how I recommend that you should do it. So he's only a few weeks or months ahead. Now, as long as you're open and honest about that, I think that can be a really powerful origin story because people feel empathy with it. You know, the truth is, when I first started out in business, I probably didn't want to learn much from Richard Branson. He may have been a really, really successful entrepreneur, but in my mind, he was so far ahead of me, and it was so long ago when he first set up, that I would probably doubt that he would understand the pain and the struggles that I was going through. I'm probably more likely to want to learn from someone who'd been successful, but had done it more recently and was just maybe a couple of years ahead of me, and then they could still remember the problems that they had when they were where I am, so that I'm more likely to learn from them. And I feel a greater degree of empathy for them. I know they're on the same path and the same journey as me. So you don't have to be a grizzled 50-year veteran in any particular area in order to be able to give valuable expert advice. You can just be those 2, 3, 4, 5 further steps on the journey, as long as you're honest and open about it and say, look, I'm here, I can teach you how I got to here if that's where you want to go, and you can kind of share in my journey. And I think that's a really powerful model. People buy into that. Often the most successful superheroes in terms of their popularity aren't the ones who are perfect like Superman. They're the ones who are human like us, like Spider-Man and Batman. So that may well be a model, the Trailblazer model, that can work really well for you. Either way, whichever model you use, any of the ones I've shown you or a model you come up with yourself, make sure it's very clear to people why you have the powers that you have. have, how you acquired them, what credibility you have with those powers, and that'll make you much more believable as an authority or an expert. See you next week.